New nature hangs her mantle green on every blooming tree, and spreads her sheets o' daisies white out o'er the grassy lea. New Phoebus cheers the crystal streams and glads the azure skies, but naught can glad the weary wight that fast endurance lies. New lavrocks wake the merry morn aloft on dewy wing. The meadow lads noontide what's
Welcome to the Rosenbach podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ames, Director of Outreach and Engagement at the Rosenbach Museum and Library in Philadelphia. This is Season 4, Celebrating the Rosenbach's Treasures, in which we consider the Rosenbach's exciting new gallery exhibition project, Treasures from the Rosenbach's Collection, and engage in conversations about the local and global connections of our remarkable rare books, manuscripts, fine art, and artifacts. In this episode, I'll talk with my valued colleague and former Rosenbach curator, Kathy Haas, about the transatlantic heritage and lasting global legacy of the French-born Philadelphian merchant Stephen Girard, whose portrait hangs in the stair hall of the Rosenbach. We'll learn about Girard, his remarkable gift to the city of Philadelphia that resulted in the establishment of a school which flourishes to this day, and the origins of a special cookie called the Girard Ginger, which has become emblematic of the institution. Kathy and I will also chat with Paul McKeever, Girard College's staff baker. Then she and I will whip up a batch of Girard Gingers. We'll get some expert baking tips from Paul and share the recipe with you so that you can try making these special cookies at home. I hope this episode of the Rosenbach podcast whets your appetite to stop by the Rosenbach, take an introductory house tour, see the portrait of Stephen Girard, check out our new treasures gallery, and explore everything our museum and library has to offer. Who gets to decide how we will be remembered after we're gone? And how do reputations, legacies, and public opinions about historical figures evolve over time? These are questions I ask myself whenever I walk past the portrait of the Philadelphian merchant and philanthropist Stephen Girard, which hangs in the stair hall at the Rosenbach Museum and Library. Those of you who have visited the museum have undoubtedly walked past it. Bass Otis's well-known portrait of the French-born Philadelphian businessman who lived from 1750 to 1831 depicts a stern-looking man, along with a view of the source of his wealth, the sea. Born into a middle-class background near Bordeaux, France, and largely self-educated, Girard settled in Philadelphia on the eve of the American Revolution and became the richest man in the early United States. He was also a passionate civic leader and philanthropist. Girard's largest and most surprising act of charity was accomplished after his death. In his will, he bequeathed most of his estate to the city of Philadelphia to establish a school for orphans. The gift shocked the city and the nation and modeled the kind of Republican charitable spirit that was in the air in the first decades after the nation's founding. Unprecedented as it was, Girard's donation of millions of dollars to build a school fits with his own life experiences, as well as his interests as a reader and intellect. Having lacked a formal education of his own, Girard voraciously devoured books written by French Enlightenment authors and seems to have wanted to give others the educational opportunities that he himself lacked. Yet Girard's gift was complicated by the racism and sexism unfortunately common among elite white men of his era of history. Girard himself was a slaveholder, and in his will, Girard stipulated that only white male orphans could attend the school, thus excluding female students, African Americans, Indigenous Americans, and any other possible students of color. This set the school up for significant legal challenges in the 20th century that became landmarks of the civil rights movement. Today, because of modifications to Girard's will made in court and operationalized by the dedicated educators who staff the institution, Girard College, which is actually a school for kids in 1st through 12th grades, plays a critical role in building a diverse and inclusive society for Philadelphia, America, and the world. It's an updated approach to Girard's legacy, rooted in his original gift. How should we interpret Stephen Girard and his place in history and local Philadelphian civic life, given his views on race and his association with enslavement? I believe the answer lies in the fact that Girard College, the institution, is today so much bigger than Stephen Girard, the man. In this podcast episode, we'll learn more about the college and how it evolved in the years following the merchant's death. We'll pay particular attention to the expansion of educational opportunities beyond Girard's original stipulations and the development of the school's unique traditions and institutional culture of today. We'll even trace the rise of the school's emblematic culinary creation, the Girard Ginger, and whip up a batch of the cookies ourselves as we talk about this incredible and multifaceted educational institution. I'm very pleased to be joined for this conversation and baking demo by Kathy Haas, Director of Historical Resources at Girard College. Kathy is a graduate of Harvard College and the Winter Tour program in American Material Culture, where she specialized in 19th century material culture and the material culture of Roman Catholicism. Kathy worked for some years as associate curator at the Rosenbach Museum and Library before taking up her current role. Podcast listeners may remember some of the wonderful exhibitions Kathy curated or co-curated while on the Rosenbach staff, including Clever Criminals and Daring Detectives, Freedom Train, Catholics in the New World, and Titanic, The Rise of Rosenbach, which inspired some episodes in the first season of the Rosenbach podcast. I'll also note that Kathy was in the collections department when I began my internship at the Rosenbach back in 2014, and I learned so much from her during that formative time in my own life. Kathy, thank you so much for joining me on the Rosenbach podcast and for the opportunity to learn more about Stephen Girard, Girard College, and Girard Gingers.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be able to join you. I'm always happy to collaborate with my friends at the Rosenbach.
Who was Stephen Girard, and how did he end up in Philadelphia?
Stephen Girard was born in Bordeaux, France in 1750. He went to sea at the age of about 14, following in the family tradition, and became a captain at the age of 23. He ended up in Philadelphia, a bit of a fluke, in June of 1776. He was actually traveling between the West Indies and New York when his ship was damaged in a storm, and he ended up putting into Philadelphia for repairs. While he was here, he found out more about the British blockade of New York and the increased British naval presence and decided that perhaps staying put made some sense. He liked what he saw, and he ended up making Philadelphia his home from 1776 until his death in 1831. He began to expand his role, moving from being a captain to being somebody who invested in ships, both either owning them outright or going in on shares. And he developed an international business network that spanned the globe. He sent ships to 5 continents, North and South America, Europe, Africa, and Asia, And that was really how he first made his fortune. He then also invested in quite a lot of real estate, both in Philadelphia and eventually beyond. Philadelphia listeners may be familiar with the Girard Estates section of Philadelphia. That's actually part of what was one of his farms down in what's now South Philadelphia. And then he made the third source of his fortune was in banking. The first bank in the United States, which is on 3rd Street here in Philadelphia, did not get its charter renewed by Congress in 1811. So Stephen Girard bought it and its assets, put his own money into it, and reopened it as Girard Bank. And it lasted in that capacity until his death in 1831. So shipping, real estate, and banking were the three legs of his fortune. And by the time of his death, he was worth on the order of about $7 million, and that is $1831. So that is a huge amount of money. He had no children. And so at the time of his death, everybody was curious to find out what was going to happen to his money.
Why did Girard decide to establish his school? And can you give us a sense of how it has evolved over the centuries?
Sure. So as I mentioned, Stephen Girard did not have any children. He did have a number of brothers and sisters, nieces and nephews, most of whom were still back in France. But what he wanted to do with his money was, rather than enrich his relatives, he wanted his money to serve the public good as he saw it. And so this was a period of real social experimentation in the country as a whole, but especially in Philadelphia. So there were a lot of people and groups of people trying to come up with ways to solve social problems through creating institutions. So, for example, Eastern State Penitentiary, which opened in 1829 but had been in development for a while, was a way to try to address some of the problems with prisons. It was a prison reform that, ended up turning out rather differently than the originators expected. But again, it was an attempt to do something new and to solve a problem. Similarly, there were creations of schools for example, schools for the deaf. What's now the Pennsylvania School for the Deaf was established in 1820. There were lots of other sorts of things like the Franklin Institute that also came around in this period as well in the early Republic. And so Stephen Girard was sort of attempting to do a very similar thing. He wanted to create a school for poor white male orphans. And the idea, I think, in his mind was both that the school would benefit the individual students who, attended the school and would be given an education and an opportunity that they would not have had otherwise. But also beyond helping those individual students, this was a way that they would become productive citizens and help improve his city, his state, and by extension, his country, so that it was an individual project, but also something to benefit the United States, or at least Philadelphia as a whole. Initially, he established the school for poor white male orphans. That was not terribly surprising to his white contemporaries at the time. What actually shocked them was in his will, he specifically said that no ministers, missionaries, or ecclesiastics were allowed to have any position at the school. And in fact, they weren't even allowed to set foot on campus. And that was actually very shocking at the time and caused the first of what have been many, many lawsuits related to the school. However, the school was allowed to open with the clergy ban in place. We opened in 1848. But obviously, the fact that it was restricted was something that was very clear to Philadelphia's African-American community. And as early as the 1890s, they began to organize and press for the desegregation of the school. The first person to really bring this out publicly was a man named Nathan Moselle. He was a Black physician and organizer, and he helped a boy named Frank Wilson to put in an application in 1891. That application was summarily rejected. He tried to bring it up with the city council, but just didn't get anywhere, as you might imagine, in the 1890s. However, he continued to speak and write about this through his very long life into the 1930s and 40s. However, it was not until the 1950s that the first sort of legal action took place. That was spearheaded by Raymond Pace Alexander, who was a Black lawyer and city council member. He brought the first lawsuit against the school. This was in 1954 in the wake of Brown v. Board. So he brought a lawsuit on behalf of boys denied admission on the basis of race. This lawsuit went through the 50s and did not succeed in desegregating the school. Fast forward again to 1965. Cecil B. Moore, who was the head of the Philadelphia branch of the NAACP, as well as a lawyer, a former Marine, and a really talented organizer, a street organizer. He picked Girard College as one of his key projects, and he began organizing a series of protests that lasted every day from May 1st through December 17th of 1965. So every day there were protesters outside the wall of the school. His goal was to force a new lawsuit, and this was successful. There was a new lawsuit that was filed in federal court in December of 1965. That lawsuit went until 1968, and in fact was successful in desegregating the school. So our first students of color entered in the fall of 1968. The school became co-ed in 1984. This was also the result of a lawsuit, although it was treated quite differently. At the time, the school was looking to expand its size, and so having the opportunity to recruit both boys and girls was something that they were interested in. So basically, there was a lawsuit filed on behalf of a female applicant, and the school basically told the court to, give us a ruling that we can have a variance from the will. The court did, and then the school was able to admit female students. So today, the population of the school is about 99% students of color and slightly more than 50% girls. So in the last 55 years, it's definitely changed quite a lot and expanded, but we're still serving the basic mission. Our students today come from single-parent families or families headed by a guardian and have financial need. We are still a residential school. We are a boarding school, which is what Stephen Girard intended at the beginning. Our students now do a 5-day program where they arrive on Sunday nights and then leave after school on Fridays and get to spend the weekend with their parent or guardian. But we're still pursuing the core mission of providing education and a safe residential environment to our students.
It's such a fascinating story. I mean, the way that Girard College has been at the center of these great, civic, cultural, and legal debates for hundreds of years now. It's quite interesting, and the fact that the school has evolved and continues, as you say, to serve that core mission is quite inspirational. Tell me a little bit more about the college today. What life is like for students when they study at Girard College, and give me a sense of the role that the institution plays in sort of the local educational community and then the national landscape of education in America.
Girard College, as we've said before, despite its name, is not a college in the conventional sense of the word. The term college was used much more broadly in the 19th century, and also Stephen Girard was French, and collège in French does not mean the same thing as college in English. So we do not serve as a postgraduate institution. Instead, we serve students in grades 1 through 12. Stephen Girard, in his will, specified that students could be at the school between ages of 6 and 18. And again, that kind of translates to 1 through 12 today. So we have 12 grades here on campus. We have a 43-acre campus in North Philadelphia on Girard Avenue. And this was land that Stephen Girard specifically bought in 1831 to put the school on. So it's a 43-acre campus surrounded by a 10-foot wall, also required by Stephen Girard's will, which helps create a real nice green space in the heart of Philadelphia. So our students are here 5 days a week. Everyone's always like, everybody boards, even the first graders. And yes, that is how it works, even the first graders. So they arrive on Sunday night, and then they stay through the week and leave on arrive Sunday night and stay through the week, and then leave on Friday afternoon and go home and spend the weekend with their family or guardian. Obviously, there's things like sports games and things like that students might be involved with other times as well. But generally, that's the setup. So we have a standard sort of elementary, middle school, and high school. We have teachers who are responsible for the students between 8 and 3 p.m., the class time. And then we have a wonderful core of residential advisors who are responsible for the students in the after school and overnight hours. And so provide after school activities, supervise homework, all that sort of thing. We provide all the meals, we provide uniforms for the students, and we, all of those sorts of needs. And we try to help our students to grow in all areas of their lives. The school is focused on preparing our students for post-secondary success. We try to make sure that all of our students who graduate have multiple college admissions offers so that they can go that route if they choose. And we try to make sure that they get connected to the resources that they need, in order to afford college and to succeed in college. And most of our students do go straight on to college, although there's always, there are a few who choose other paths as well. Because we've been around for a very long time, we have experimented with many different ways of educating and spent a lot of time thinking about how best to educate students coming from disadvantaged financial backgrounds. And one of the things that I really find interesting as a historian is looking how the experience of Girard maps onto the larger history of educational history. And so, you see them adapting as throughout history, as we learn more about children and child psychology and various other things, really incorporating that. In the 19th century, the school was very regimented. The kids marched in lines and did everything in size order and had to eat in silence and all that kind of stuff. And, and then, they really started to shift as they began to understand things better and, tried to move towards a more home-like environment and smaller groups and less formal. Obviously there's a certain amount of order that you need to have in any kind of large boarding school, but, trying to make it more child-centered, which really begins, I would say, in the early progressive period and continues throughout the 20th century and into the current state of affairs. And we are a pretty unique school. So Girard College was famous from its outset and inspired a lot of other schools. So the Ellis School for Girls, Carson Valley College, Milton Hershey School, and a number of others. But there aren't a whole lot of us around doing, the original thing. A lot of them have changed their missions. Hershey School is still serving, sort of their original goal of being a school. But there's been, a lot has changed in the last 175 years. And, to be still doing what we do is kind of unusual. And we really, are the only school providing, the only school in Philadelphia providing a full scholarship boarding opportunity. It's a pretty unique niche. And it's great to be able to provide those opportunities to our students.
Tell listeners a little bit about the rich historical resources available for study at Girard College, and how can listeners learn more about the school and its history? A related question is the school open for visiting by anyone who might be interested in coming to see this really fascinating historic site?
So in his will, in addition to giving the money to create the school, and I should say that out of his estate, Stephen Girard left about $6 million to create the school, $2 million as a building fund, and the rest of it to perform the endowment, which still provides 90% of the school's operating funds. So that he gave the money to create the school in his will. But then also in his will, he specified that his books and papers were to come to the school, be set aside and preserved, and also that his furniture and silver should also come to the school. And his executors pretty much took that as an excuse to take everything that wasn't nailed down in his house and bring it here. So there's been a museum collection from the beginning, from the time the school opened in 1848. And over time, that has grown and expanded. So inspired by the founder, I think, who kept lots and lots of stuff. His papers run to hundreds of thousands of pages covering life in Philadelphia and all of its many facets. But inspired by him, I think the school kept track of its own history pretty well. And so we have everything from the original architectural drawings for designing and building the school in the 1840s, all the way up through, last year's yearbook. And so we've got things that talk about curriculum throughout the different periods of our history. We have menu books that document what the students were eating. We have yearbooks and student newspapers. We have materials that document the civil rights struggles to desegregate the school. We have oral histories with people who were involved in, these, both the pivotal moments like the civil rights struggle, but also just oral histories that document what it was like to be a student here at different time periods. So we have quite a rich collection of fine and decorative arts, books, manuscripts, papers relating to Stephen Girard and Girard College, but that have real resonance far beyond our walls because they document such a large slice of life in Philadelphia. So these are kept in a museum in Founders Hall, which is the original main building for the campus. And so you can find out more about us at foundershall.org, which is the website for the museum. We also do campus tours, historical campus tours, and provide other opportunities for people to get to learn about us either by visiting in person or by experiencing some of our materials on the web. We have virtual tours, et cetera, et cetera. So we have some pretty cool stuff, and we'd love people to get to check it out at foundershall.org.
Let's switch gears and talk some more about Girard gingers. What is known about how this ginger originated? And I gather that it's pretty important to the culture of the school.
So we don't know exactly when the Girard ginger originated. It seems to have already been in place by the time of the Civil War and could very well date back even further into the 1850s. We know that Charles Hummel, who was the very long-time baker at the school, he came in 1874 and retired in 1917. He said that he had gotten the recipe from a man named Fred Fugel, who was the baker at around the time of the Civil War. So it goes back at least that far and probably farther, although the origins itself are shrouded a bit in the mists of time. However, it has always been a staple and an important part of Girard history. So originally it was served every other Sunday, and then that kind of transitioned into it being served every Sunday as part of the dinner. And it, even more than being a treat that was consumed on Sundays, it also became part of the fabric of the Girard College life, because students would keep the gingers and trade them and use them as a form of currency. Some of this was official, so students who had sort of jobs on campus, like shelving books in the library, might have been paid in a stack of gingers that they could then trade with their classmates. But also some of it was just informal, of people keeping them from dinners or whatever and swapping them. They don't go bad. They dry out, but can be easily reconstituted by dipping them in tea or coffee or water, and so they held their value as a currency. So they were an important part of Girard life. And we know that this trading in gingers goes back into the 19th century. And I've also heard plenty of 20th century alums talk about it. So they were important enough that the 1945 annual report, right in the wake of World War II, was talking about how the continuation of post-war rationing had affected the recipe for gingers. They actually had to reduce the amount of fat and sugar that was used in the ginger. And so that meant that they would go stale faster. And traditionally, they had been made on Fridays and given out on Sundays. But instead, they actually had to switch to giving them out on Fridays because they didn't keep as well with the changes that had been made by rationing. So again, this was important enough that it made it into the president's annual report to the board of the school. In the around 1940, they were making 4,000 gingers a week. That was for a student population of about 1,700 students, just to give you a sense of what a size of this operation was. And they've always been beloved by alumni. You can go back into the very earliest alumni newsletters we have that date back into the 1880s, and people are remembering them from their school days and scheming about how they want to get gingers for their class reunions. And there's a holiday every year called Founders Day, which is our big alumni day. And so alumni would buy gingers off of students. Students would hoard their gingers so they could offload them at a profit to the alumni. That no longer happens today, but we do still produce them to be sold by our Boy Scouts on Founders Day to the alumni. So there's definitely a strong alumni bond with the ginger that continues to this day.
Tell me a little bit about how the gingers taste. And I know that I have kept on referring to them as a cookie, but I understand that they sort of live in a liminal zone between cookie and cake. How would you sort of encapsulate the flavor and mouthfeel of this interesting historical dessert?
So they're definitely not a cookie in the way that we most generally think of a cookie. They're quite large. They're many inches across and pretty thick. So they're more cakey in that way. And they are, when they're fresh, they're sort of crumbly. And then as they dry out again, they get hard, but you can reconstitute them by dipping them into a liquid. Their primary flavor is of molasses. So they are more of a molasses cake than a spice cake. There are spices in them, but it's not like a ginger snap or something where your overwhelming flavor is of the spice. It's predominantly a molasses cake. And again, this is going back to its creation, in the period of the Civil War or even before, where this is, that was a pretty common sweetener and common flavoring. They're a little bit on the drier side, I would say, but they're really yummy. And again, I think they're particularly good with a glass of milk or a cup of tea or some sort of beverage.
As an avid tea drinker, I think I may have discovered my new favorite tea time treat. I'm very, very much looking forward to trying a Girard ginger with my morning tea. So that's a mental note that I'm making about how to enjoy these delicious desserts. Talk me through the various historic recipes for the Girard ginger. Obviously, with a sort of product, a delicious item with this much history, I'd imagine the recipe has evolved a little bit over time. And we're going to do some baking together. So I'm curious about what recipe we'll be using today to make a sort of smaller batch size.
Yeah, so that is one of the challenges is that they were, for the purposes of Girard College, they're made in quantity, right? And so scaling anything down to home kitchen, requires a little bit of tweaking. But there are recipes that we have going back into the 19th century. So the earliest recipes that we have utilize lard as the basis for the fat and call for both winter and spring flour. In the recipe, that's a harder and a softer flour. It's the precursor to, nowadays we use all-purpose flour, but they didn't have that then. So you were supposed to mix two different kinds of flour to get that. So that's, something you can see in the earliest recipes. They have quite a lot of molasses in them. And it's interesting, one of the early recipe books that we have doesn't even list the amount of flour. It gives the recipe, gives the amount of other ingredients, which includes 60 pounds worth of sugar and 4.5 buckets of molasses, just again, to give you a sense of the quantity in which that they are baking these things, but did not include any amount of flour. So my assumption is that the baker who had this particular cookbook, a guy named Thomas Underdown, must have sort of known that you just added enough flour till it got to the right consistency or something like that. Or maybe he could just remember and he just needed the recipe for the rest of it. But in any event, as you move into the 20th century, you start to see changes. Obviously, the introduction of all-purpose flour, the replacement of lard with other forms of fat, either margarine or shortening, as opposed to pig products. There's also a change in how they make the ginger, in the sense that originally they were rolled out and cut. And then in the 20th century, they came up with a way to make it slightly moister so that it could be done as a drop rather than having to roll them out and cut them. And by the 1930s, they actually had what's described in the alumni magazine as a ginger making machine that would sort of, I guess, drop the batter onto like a conveyor belt that would then whisk them off. And the alumni magazine raved about how much more quickly they could produce. I think it was something like make 2,000 gingers in half an hour using their new ginger machine. But the recipe was famous and popular enough that the original Betty Crocker picture cookbook, which was created in 1950, actually includes a recipe for the Girard ginger, along with a little pictogram showing Founders Hall, which is our main building. It calls them gingies and actually includes a recipe for an icing for them. That is not authentic. I have never seen an iced ginger here on campus. But, again, it speaks to the fact that these were well-known and beloved by generations of Girard students, but also that it had, wider cultural appeal at the time. There was a period in which they were not being produced on campus at Girard. There was a period in the late 20th century where it was sort of off-sited and different bakeries were doing things. But then it was brought back on campus and is produced on campus today.
Thanks for answering my questions, Kathy. How about if we head over to the kitchen for a chat about Girard gingers with Chief Baker Paul McKeever?
That'll be great. He is the custodian of the Girard ginger recipe and the proud baker of the Girard gingers today.
Paul, thanks so much for joining us on the Rosenbach podcast today.
Certainly glad to be here and glad to celebrate anything that has to do with the Girard tradition of the Girard ginger.
First, tell me a little bit about yourself. How did you end up becoming the chief baker of Girard gingers at the college?
Actually, I'll tell you, I started working here at Girard as an assistant cook. They call it the cook's helper. And oddly enough, my grandmother was about 92 years old before she passed. And when I found out I was working at Girard College, she said, "Do they still have those ginger cakes?" And at the time, I didn't know anything about it. About a couple years later, an interim president came in, and he was an alumni, and his name was Dr. Maxwell, and he wanted to know from the food service director why they weren't getting gingers on a regular basis. And at that time, they had just switched me over. I had learned the baking traits of baking from scratch. And so I was doing handling the baking services at that time. And they came to me and said, "You have to make these Girard gingers," and showed me the recipe for the first time. And that was in 1987. So since 1987, I have become the custodian of the ginger recipe.
How does it feel to be connected to such a long culinary tradition here at the college? And what do these Girard gingers mean to you personally?
It's an honor. It's just basically it's an honor. They're referred to affectionately, a couple of nicknames. One of the earliest bakers that was baking them had the last name Hummel, called them Hum Muds. Some people to this day, Kathy and I will both agree and say we're not sure, but which came first, calling Girard the Hum instead of their home. And did it come because of the Hummels and the Hum Muds that they called? They're nicknamed as Hum Muds. They're nicknamed as Ginnies. They were even nicknamed as Sabbath cakes because back in the late 1800s, they were a Sunday night treat, and they would call them the Sabbath cakes. So there was so many different, very types of names that the kids would do, but it was definitely something that when you find out about it, you sit there and say, well, this is pretty unique as a tradition. And the fact that I'm here 41 years in service, and for about 34 or 35 years, I've been the custodian of the Hum Mud recipe. And it's one of the proudest things that I get to be involved in.
So what will the emotions be like for you to have to train someone else to take on this role? Do you think it'll be a challenge to pass the ginger, so to speak?
Yeah, they're not as common as, like I said, they're in competition now with all the ready-made snacks and everything, but there is still a strong showing of people that still, even more so in the last 10 years or more, that graduates are willing to participate in the alumni and impart with all the other traditions here that they would definitely don't want to see the gingers stopping. So, yeah, I have a couple guys in mind, and they're guys that worked under me. I trained them. I'm certainly going to make sure that they get the recipe, and then I'll tell them the little tips that they would get to make them keep their shape so well, and it has a lot to do with the list of ingredients and how you assemble them.
Paul, thank you again so very much for sharing your thoughts and insights, and thank you for carrying on this important historic legacy.
Yeah, it is. It's an honor. I can't say it any other better than that. That is certainly an honor to carry this on. I'm thankful that I have that responsibility. Thank you.
Kathy, I've worked up an appetite with all this talk about Girard gingers. How about if you and I start baking?
Sounds great.
Kathy and I are aproned up and ready to start baking Girard gingers. For those of you eager to make them yourselves, I'm pleased to share that you'll find our recipe online at rosenbach.org/podcast. Kathy, talk us through your process.
All right, so we're going to use the recipe that's in Ernest Cunningham's Memories of Girard College, adapted for modern ingredients. So it's got regular all-purpose flour rather than winter and spring flour, and we're going to be using Crisco instead of lard. But otherwise, it's pretty much the same. I've noticed a few things also from his recipe, having made it before, is I think their ovens must have run a little differently than they do today, because he says to cook them at 450 degrees, and if you do that, you're going to end up with burned on top. So we're going to put them in at more like, I think Paul says 350. I've done 375, but you can kind of play around with that. But I think their ovens must have just been a little bit different. He's pretty conservative on the spices. So his recipe originally calls for 3 pounds of flour, I guess 2 3/4 pounds of flour, and then half a teaspoon of all the spices. So that's what's in the translated version that we have. But you can always feel free to add a little bit more of the spices if you want to make it a little more.
What's your preference personally?
I give I go for I like the original recipe. I'm also don't want to like mess anything up, but I'll kind of do a rounded teaspoon.
Sure.
I'll err on the more side. Yeah. And I know that Paul, as he was saying, he adds a little bit more cinnamon to the recipe when he makes it. So again, people can play with it a little bit, but it is overwhelmingly a molasses cookie or molasses cake rather than a spice cake.
Well, and when our listeners actually see the Girard ginger, they'll see the ambiguity about what precisely to call it. Because it looks like a cookie, but it feels like a cake.
It's a small cake or a big cookie. Right. What it was alternated with at the beginning was something that was called Dutch cake, which was also in that sort of gray space. I think it had raisins in it. So, alrighty. So the first step is to cream the sugar shortening, salt, and spices together. So I think this recipe makes 25. I think we'll scale it down. Is it okay if we make a quarter recipe? That's 6. Because then you'll have between that and what Paul gave us, we'll have at least a dozen cookies.
We'll have a dozen cookies.
Back to the Rosenbach.
Yeah, I'm going to feed all of my Rosenbach colleagues with a dozen cookies and also save a couple for myself.
Excellent.
Because, I think it's a just reward after all the labors.
We do a half recipe. How much? Really do a half recipe.
Yeah.
All right, we'll do that. I'll make a dozen.
Also, I want listeners to know that I'm just sitting here not helping.
Oh, you can jump right in here.
Kathy is such an expert baker that I have some talent, but compared to you,
well,
I don't think
this is the home version. One of the other challenges, you were asking if we could make them with Paul, but one of the other challenges is that if you go into the kitchens, our kitchens are, of course, industrial-sized kitchens, and so I'm using a regular, KitchenAid stand mixer here, but of course the mixers they have in there are huge, and so you can't really make one little batch of something because they cook on an industrial scale in there. So we're winging it down here in the student center.
Well, it must just be an absolutely massive job to keep all the students fed.
Yes, three meals a day. It's a lot, snacks, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And it has an impact. I was actually doing a series of oral history interviews. Actually, I should say that I was working with the high school seniors who did a series of oral history interviews last Founders Day with some of our alumni. And one of the alumni, a female alumna, was saying that, when the questions was, how do you think Girard influenced the rest of your life? And she actually talked about, that she appreciated how Girard taught her to eat, that, eating good, well-balanced, nutritious meals at a regular schedule, that meant a lot. And then she went off to college and, she succumbed to the temptation to eat pizza at 2 a.m. And then she realized she didn't really feel very good when she did that. And she kind of went back to, the way that she'd eaten at Girard, which she said was also the way her mom felt about food, real food, nutritious food. And she felt like, that was something that she took away from her time here. So I made sure to tell the folks who run the food service here about that, that what they do not only makes a difference for our kids on a day-to-day level, but, can be something that carries forward into the rest of their lives.
Well, and as both you and Paul were talking about earlier, it's a sort of education for the whole person. Which I don't think we do enough of in our society. I mean, the public school system, despite all of its wonderful qualities, also has challenges. And I think one of those is, giving people skills in all aspects of life.
All together. So we're mixing that. It's all brown sugar. There's no white sugar. It's brown sugar shortening, allspice, ginger, cinnamon, and cloves. And some salt, because the shortening is not salted. I suppose if you were using margarine or butter, you could probably use the salt if this is tree salted, but not for this. said. All right. And the molasses. So
The key ingredient.
that's right. So while he only calls for half a teaspoon of spices to go with 10 cups of flour, he calls for 3 cups of molasses. So as you say, it's a very much a molasses-based thing. So, and I forgot to bring my glass measure, so we're just going to do
We're
it
just
with
going to wing it.
We're just going to do it with, I had it, son helped me find it last night, and I just forgot to bring it.
I'm sure that they're valued and loved at all times of year, but especially, as Paul was saying, for fall. It's just
They're very nice. They're very much we think about ginger cookies and molasses cookies in the fall. And of course, there's, they go back a long ways. It was a very common kind of cookie in the 19th century.
So what's it like to work as a history professional in this very vibrant school environment? Were you prepared for that when you stepped into this role?
Well, I will say that the Rosenbach prepared me pretty well in the sense that the Rosenbach is a small but mighty staff. And so having spent 12 years there, I had learned to do quite a lot of things. I'd learned something about books and manuscripts, which was not what I'd come into. I was more of a curator person coming in, and I learned a lot about books and manuscripts, at least enough to not screw things up, I guess is my goal. And I learned about installing exhibits, and I got to learn, I did programs, under the direction of people like Emily and others. So I got to do a little bit of everything, which was very useful because when I came here, I am the museum staff. So I do everything from write the grants to give the tours to rehouse the collection to, be involved with construction projects, you name it. So I felt like
That's a lot.
it was good that I came in. I'm going to turn the mixer back on. So this has to beat for 3 minutes. So I'm a jack of all trades, and that's what I enjoy about my job here is I get to, every day is different. Every time, I'm doing different things. It's a bit of a challenge because I'm not equally good in everything, right? Sure, so there's some things where I'm like, if I know what I would hire if I had a second person. But, it's amazing that a 1 through 12 school invests in their history and invests in their collection enough to have somebody like me around, and I'm really grateful for that.
Do you feel like the teachers and administrators and other people take advantage of the collection and you've sort of integrated into the staff here?
Well, it's an ongoing process, and I think we definitely took a step back during COVID just because when everything switched to virtual and then there was a lot of catch-up and, some staffing changes and stuff. But I definitely think we've been rebuilding, and this year, especially with the 175th, it's been a good opportunity for me to connect with teachers, and we're planning a school-wide project with students in all grades doing projects related to our campus and their relationship to it and incorporating our history. And so that's something that's been a big touch point. And I had a really productive meeting with all the social studies teachers from 1 through 12 about ways that we can work together. So I think it's been a bit of a rebuilding, but we do some fabulous stuff. And, and it's across the grades. So, for example, when the 7th grade reads about yellow fever, they read Fever 1793. Stephen Girard ran the fever hospital here at Bush Hill, which is not too far from where we're standing right now. We have lots of records about that, so we do a program with the 7th grade where they get to work with original documents and report out to, we break them into groups and they work on documents and then they report out to their classmates about what they learned and what questions they had. So, this is something that we've, that's an example of something that we've definitely been able to keep doing even last year and the year before, but we're trying to expand and do more, especially now that things are finally back to normal after the COVID confusion. So,
well, I just think it's such an incredibly unique learning environment. I mean, how many students read Fever 1793, which is such a well-known text, and then actually look at not just digitized versions of original documents, but actually handle the documents themselves, which is really part of the Rosenbach philosophy, which probably many of our listeners know. I mean, this is critical to how we interpret collections of the Rosenbach. So I definitely see the connection there that you're describing.
Yeah. And learning to ask questions. So if you look at the inventory of all the stuff that was at the hospital and you see that they had, for example, many, many, many more spoons than they had forks or knives, what does that tell you about what they were feeding people, right? And, so they can, the kids are able to sort of look at that and it doesn't necessarily jump off the page at them. And I say, oh, but what do you notice? What do you think that means? And they're like, oh, they're probably feeding them a lot of soup and porridge. And I'm like, yeah, that's right. So they learn to kind of make those kinds of jumps from some of the materials. So, all right. And add a little bit of water. 3/4 of a cup. So we're making a half. So it's going to be 3/8. Less than half a cup. 3/4 of a teaspoon of baking soda to that.
I do.
All right. So This is a 1 teaspoon and a half.
Oh, thank you so much.
So I think it's 3/4 of a teaspoon. So it's whichever way you prefer to measure it. You're going to have to do some eyeballing.
Yes.
That's okay.
Let's see if I can do this.
They were measuring things in buckets in the 19th century, according, in our recipes. In fact,
5 buckets of lard.
yeah, exactly. So, and it's an recipe that doesn't have any eggs or milk or anything. It's reliant on baking soda for its rise.
Yes.
So
Okay, so I have added it. I have not mixed it.
Oh, you should mix it up.
Okay, I'm gonna mix it up.
Because you don't want clumps.
We
of
don't want
baking.
clumps of soda in our gingers.
So we're gonna add the flour, and then the soda goes in last.
Okay, so I'll just let this sit here.
Let that sit there.
This may be the most pleasant Friday afternoon job task I've had in a while.
Yeah, it's nice.
There are certain virtues to hosting the Rosenbach podcast. So, how do most alumni feel about Stephen Girard himself, or is he just is the college itself nowadays, the institution, I guess, sufficiently removed from Girard as a person that Girard himself, it doesn't really matter quite as much? How would you describe sort of the collective memory around the founder?
Well, I think there's many different answers to that, right? We have many alums, and many different generations of alums as well. Mm-hmm. I think that. I think that there's definitely a great deal of gratitude to Stephen Girard for creating the school and for endowing the school. It is his money that still keeps the place running. Mm-hmm. I definitely think with some of the, as I say, 90% of our operating costs, our operating funds still come from the endowment that he left in 1830, which is really kind of crazy, right? But, I think that especially among younger alumni, there is some engagement with, the complexities, right? That he was somebody who made a lot of money, in ways that did involve slavery. So he himself held slaves in Philadelphia and property owned in Louisiana. He certainly made money from things like coffee, sugar, which were products of the, slave labor in the Caribbean and so forth. So I think that people are aware of the complexities. It's no surprise. The first person mentioned in his will is actually his enslaved woman, Hannah, who he frees. She's the last enslaved person that he held in Philadelphia, and he frees her in his will and provides her with a $200 a year allowance.
Which was a really substantial sum.
So to be provided by Pennsylvania Hospital, he left them money to do that. It's something that people have known about for ages, and I think, it's just now becoming something that people are more thinking about.
Sure.
So I would say it's a mixed bag, and it depends on the alumnus and on the generation and on the person. But, so I can't speak as a whole, but, I think there is a lot of understanding that it is a unique school. And people always ask me, what do I think Stephen Girard would think if he came back today and saw the school? And obviously I can't speak for him either. All right, need the water. Okay. And I can't speak for him either, even less than I can speak for the alumni. But,
right.
I hope he was a very practical person,
Yes.
And I think, I like to think that if he came back today, he would realize that times have changed and his views were not the way that things ought to be, and that he would recognize that the students that we have here are the students that he wanted, who need assistance, and, we can offer something to. And I can't, or not, that's what he would think, but I hope that it is, because, as they say, he was a very practical person, and I'm hoping that he would see that if he came from, he is buried at Girard College. He's buried right downstairs from where I work. So, people also always ask me if the place is haunted, and he's never come and talked to me, but I can certainly tell you that if he did, or if I got my Ouija board connected up, that's one of the questions I would very much like to know the answer to.
Well, yeah, and I think another great way to frame that sort of discussion is if Girard had come of age in our time with the values that shape our society today, surely his philanthropic spirit would reflect the values of today. One would imagine.
One would hope so.
Yeah.
And again, as they say, he also hired and worked with, and had plenty of free blacks who worked for him. The maritime trades were had a lot of black sailors in them, and we know that we have records from some of the ones that worked on his ships. James Fortin, the sailmaker, did business at his bank. We have a check that's signed by Fortin, and he shows up in some of the record books. So again, it's a complicated story. And in terms of girls, he actually left, in addition to leaving money to create Girard College, he left some money to the fledgling Philadelphia public school system, which was brand new at that time, but then also left some money to create a school in Passyunk, which is now part of South Philly, but at the time was a separate town. And that was a day school, and that was for both boys and girls. So, he thought about these things at least.
Well, it just goes to show the complexity of that moment in American history, as we discussed earlier. Yeah. It's very difficult to arrive at any firm answer about the sort of morals and ethics and how it connected with ideas of citizenship and republicanism, equality. It's complicated, and yet, as you say, here we are because of Girard's gift.
Yeah. Alrighty. I think we got some dough here. So why don't we? Either I can bring. I guess can we bring your stuff over and put it on?
Absolutely. Let's go closer to the stove. That looks nice.
I'm just giving you some of the leavings. All right. Okay. So let's pop these in the oven. I preheated to 375.
Okay, I'm bringing my pan over too. And we bake them for how long?
10 to 12 minutes and kind of check on them.
Okay.
Cleaning. You want to?
Absolutely.
You want to make some gingers?
To wash my pan. So let's see here.
You've seen what they look like. I'm making mine a little smaller, but the full-size gingers are quite big across.
Oh my gosh, the dough itself smells so good.
Yeah.
No, this is perfect. So I got 4.
Okay. So this made 10. So we made
that's good.
A little scant of our 12, but that's okay.
I'm so excited to try one of these historic gingers. Kathy and I have pulled up some chairs and are sitting down with fresh Girard gingers warm from the oven, along with some glasses of milk. Let's sample them and see how they taste. This is quite delicious.
Good. Did it come out good? Is it sort of cakey in the middle?
It's cake. It's nice, and it has a cookie-like exterior and a soft cake-like interior.
Yeah. Good. Then we've succeeded.
This is delicious. So warm. I feel like I'm biting into a beautiful autumn.
Good.
Good. Delicious.
As you can see, it's a good cookie. It's a good thing to have with a glass of milk or a cup of tea or something down too, because it's got that little bit of that molasses and that spice in it.
But I can see, we talked earlier about icing and how there's, some recipes that propose an icing. I can see how that would be really tasty.
It could be.
Also, not necessary.
Yeah, I've never seen an example in any of the recipes I've ever seen or any of the photographs that involve icing. So go for it if you want, but, we're sticking with the traditional approach here.
Now, are the students ever, they're baked on a Friday, served on a Sunday, or that was traditionally?
That was traditionally how it was done, yeah.
Are they ever served warm and fresh out of the oven?
I don't think that's true anymore. Because we pretty much make them now for events, things like Founders Day. They're not part of the regular rotation, so usually they're baked in advance and so they're not. But they were not typically served warm anyway. They were usually, as I say, baked and then stored. Although definitely there's, definitely stories of kids, clamoring. They were clamoring for them, by the back gate and seeing if they could get their hands on some of them when they were still warm.
It's kind of, I think the next time I have a dinner party or an event, I'm going to make some of these.
They're very historic, and goes all the way back to the Civil War. But they're good. There's a reason that people still want to have them. Obviously, the nostalgia factor is a big part of it, but there's also they're good. They're yummy.
Well, as you well know, there are so many and I might add, as listeners to Rosenbach Test Kitchen from last season will know, there are a lot of recipes from this time period that you wouldn't want to eat, nostalgia or otherwise.
Yeah.
And this is still very familiar. The flavor is still very familiar. Yep. I think for me, the most compelling thing about it is the texture.
That's the thing that's unusual about it, because it's not a cookie, and it's somewhere between the cake cookie thing. It's different that way. Yeah.
Yeah. And I find that really pleasing because it takes my favorite cookie flavor, the molasses and ginger, and puts it into a really fascinating texture. Thanks so much for baking with me today, Kathy. To conclude, I'd like to pose a final question to you. You worked at the Rosenbach for quite a few years, and now you're immersed in the fantastic collection at Girard College. What role do you think collections like those at both institutions play in education and culture broadly conceived?
Well, this is something that I'm constantly trying to incorporate here at Girard College, that being able to work with primary sources is something that I want to expose all of our students here, grades 1 through 12, as a way of really engaging with history, learning to ask questions, learning to think about sources, and just getting excited by the incredible materials that we have and the stories that they tell. So I feel very strongly that everybody should be engaging with material culture, with written materials, and with the past through the collections of institutions such as ours.
Kathy, thanks so much for welcoming me to Girard College today, for welcoming me into this really amazing collection that sits at the foundation of a transformational educational institution here in the city we call home. I appreciate your time, and I'm going to enjoy munching on these Girard gingers.
Thanks so much for coming over and baking with me and learning about this important part of our history.
Thank you for listening to the Rosenbach podcast. Check back soon for another glimpse into the Rosenbach's remarkable collection of rare books, manuscripts, art, and artifacts, and for more fascinating conversations about history, art, and culture. To learn more about the Rosenbach and to plan your visit to see treasures from the Rosenbach's collection, visit rosenbach.org. We host a variety of on-site and online events and public programs, and we always welcome questions from listeners about how to use our collections. Today's episode hints at some of the themes, topics, and collection areas to be explored in the upcoming additions to our Treasures exhibition galleries. In June 2025, we will open a gallery devoted to continental European literature, book history, Judaica, and Rosenbach family history, which will feature our French language books and manuscripts speaking to Stephen Girard's early heritage. In June 2026, we will open a third gallery titled Literature and History of the Americas, which will highlight collections of the Revolutionary and early national eras in which Stephen Girard figured so prominently. Keep an eye out for new information about these exciting upcoming gallery exhibitions. The Rosenbach's community reaches all around the globe, brought together by our love for history, rare books, manuscripts, and the arts. I hope you will consider supporting the Rosenbach and this podcast by becoming a member today. It's one of the best ways you can support our work. Memberships start at just $55 and give you access to everything we have to offer, online and in person. If you cannot make a financial contribution, please give our podcast a good rating on Apple Podcast or wherever you listen to help us build our audience. The Rosenbach podcast is supported by a generous grant from the Evelyn Toll Family Foundation. Thanks again, and I look forward to continuing our conversation about the Rosenbach's treasures on the next episode of the Rosenbach podcast.
Grim vengeance yet shall whet a sword that through thy soul shall gate. The weeping blood in a woman's breast was never known to thee, nor the balm that drops on wounds of woe frae woman's pitying ee. My son, may kinder stars upon thy fortune shine, and may those pleasures gild thy reign that ne'er would blink on mine. God keep thee frae thy mother's face, or turn their hearts to thee. And where thou meet'st thy mother's friend, remember him for me. O Sultani, may summer suns nae mair light up the morn, nae mair tae me the autumn winds wave o'er the yellow corn. And in the narrow house o' death let winter only rave, and the next flowers that deck the spring bloom on my